And she was just saying, well, I hate men, I hate this, I hate that. And so she went to therapy, and through the process of therapy, it was like, well, the person who sinned against me was my father. It wasn't fathers.
Right.
And so, sometimes when we take the sin of an individual and then we conflate it with that must represent this entire group, then what happens is now we're in bondage.
Right.
You see?
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Salty Pastor Podcast, a podcast dedicated to helping you grow in your faith. We want to coach you up so that you can think for yourself and know what you believe and why you believe it. My name is Jesse Mayer. I'll be your host, but we cannot do this without the one, the only, the Salty Pastor himself, trademarked and everything, Dr. Douglas Peak.
Hey, everyone. So good to be with you. And May is my birthday month. So I'm going to be turning the big 6-0 this month. And let me tell you, it has got me deep thinking, reminiscing, evaluating. It's quite something else.
Yeah, you're looking back on those 6-0 and trying to figure out what's next, right? What's the next exciting thing in your life?
I just keep looking in the mirror and go, who's that old person who keeps looking back at me? Because you certainly don't feel that way. You know what they say is that 60 is the new 40.
Oh, is that what they say?
I don't know, but I'm hoping.
That's what you say?
That's what I'm saying. All my salty crew out there, help me out here. Get this ball rolling. But things are good. Yeah, I am excited. I think we are at the point we're going to launch the Salty Pastor website.
Yes, we should be launching. You should be able to get to it next week. Wait for an official announcement. We'll do an unveiling on the podcast. But as long as no technical gremlins get into it,
yeah. Because it's not just a basic website, where you go and there's a picture and say, oh, this is about us and the Salty Pastor. The whole point of the website we've been building infrastructure is it has access to all of these videos. It has access eventually to merchandise and to books and to all different other types of training programs. So there's a lot of content, and also there's a lot of embedded. I don't know the terminology for it, but it allows you to access all of this videos and search. You got to have search in there because. And we got like almost 400 episodes.
This is as you clicked on this today, you would have noticed this is episode 399. Oh my. Listeners. So
Thursday will be 400.
We'll celebrate the big 6-0 and the big 400 all in the same week.
That is something else, man. That is crazy. But hey, there's a lot of new stuff happening, and so pretty excited about the Salty Pastor.
Absolutely. Well, we are actually doing something new today as well, Pastor, because we finished our series last week all about the proofs of God and about the battle and what's going on in the world today. And man, you were more salty and fired up than I think I've seen you in the previous 397 episodes on Thursday. But we are moving into something a little more pleasant and fun.
Yay.
Motherhood, which, I mean, you might have some female listeners come back to you and say those aren't the same words they would use to describe motherhood.
That's true.
But we want to lift up those mothers, the importance of mothers, and highlight the women who are devoted to one of the most important aspects of life, developing children into functional adults. They're creating the next generation, and they're the primary keystone in that, right? So
yeah, and, one of the things about the Salty Pastor that I really want to keep at the forefront is that we really coach people up in their faith by getting them into the Bible. We really want to understand, well, what does the Bible say? What does it actually mean? So many people, are trying to say, well, this is what the Bible means, and it's not anywhere close.
Or they don't even use the Bible, and they just...
Yeah, and I think what's really interesting is that if you want to grow in your faith, just like any process of growth, there are certain non-negotiables, right? Things that you have to do that are necessary to growth. For instance, if you want to be an incredible lead guitarist in a band, then you're going to have to practice playing lead riffs, right? You can't just listen to them. You got to actually practice them before you'll ever be able to play with a band. If you want to be an Olympic athlete, you'll never become at that level or grow to that level unless you work out and get in real competitive shape. So in the same way, there are certain non-negotiable things that come with spiritual growth. And we want people to grow stronger in their own faith. And one of the ways in which you have to do that, or is a non-negotiable in the process of doing that, is learning how to honor your mother and your father, which is hard for some people. It's really interesting when I was just a young buck starting out, and people would say, in high school youth group, yeah, you got to honor your mother and your father. The vast majority of kids in my peer group had their parents, together, and they were, predominantly complaining about how mom or dad wouldn't let them do certain things. But today, the majority of young people have broken families or blended families, and they have a relationship with one mom or with one parent and not with the other parent, right? And so when you say honor your mother and father, the first thing that comes to the mind for a lot of these young people who are now adults is that, well, I can't do that because you didn't know my father, or you didn't know my mom, or you don't know what my dad did. You don't know what my mom did. And so I think, though, it's really important to understand that the Bible has a lot of teaching on this. And it's also important to understand is the Bible taught this when people back then were just as, they had just same failure rate or even greater. We had a lot of fathers, you read the Old Testament, that were terrible fathers. You read about moms that were terrible moms.
It looks different in some ways, but in a lot of ways it's the same.
Yeah, and in the midst of all of this stuff is the teaching. And so we have to say, well, why is it there? And why is it so important to understand, even in the midst of maybe your own really bad experience? And so I want us to go back to the scriptures in a deep and meaningful way. And the very first place that we're told is about honor your mother and father is in Exodus, when the 10 Commandments are rolled out by Moses, okay? Right. But instead of going through all the Old Testament passages right now, I just wanted to go to Matthew chapter 15, where we see Jesus bringing it back up again. And it's interesting in the context. And the context is the Pharisees just came and criticized Jesus because his disciples were not washing their hands before they ate. Okay. So they weren't following a law.
It wasn't a sanitation thing. It was a law thing.
Yeah, it was part of the Mosaic law, albeit a pretty, specific way down the list kind of law. It wasn't one of the top
One of the
ones.
addendums of an addendum of an addendum.
Yeah, you got to wash your hands before you eat. So they're complaining in this first couple verses of chapter 15, the gospel according to Matthew. And so Jesus replies to them. He goes, look, why do you break the command of God for the sake of your own tradition? God is the one who said, honor your father and mother. And then he goes on to say, and anyone who curses their father or mother is to be put to death. But you say that if anyone declares that what might have been used to help their father or mother has been devoted to God, then they are not to honor their father or mother with it. Thus you nullify the word of God for the sake of your tradition.
Will you explain that to me? I'm confused.
Well, basically he's saying, okay, you got to honor your mother and father, and also anyone who curses their father or mother is to be put to death. Now, we think, cursing is like using a bad word.
Right. Swearing.
Or swearing, and that's not what a curse was. Back then, it's something totally different. But he goes on to say, what's happening is, he says, well, if somebody, a son, right, or daughter, is supposed to take something, right, to honor their mother and father with it, but if they say, well, I devoted it to God, and they could do that by going to the temple and having a Pharisee say, I received that as something devoted, or I'll declare it devoted to God for a kickback.
Right.
Right. So they would pay a sacrifice, like a certain percent of the value of the thing, whatever it might be, and then say, well, this is now devoted to God. And
basically,
so then
basically hiding money from your taxes or something of that nature is kind of what they were doing.
And so Jesus is just calling them out and saying, you've nullified the word of God for your own tradition. You're saying, oh, this is devoted to God, so you don't have to honor your mother and father with it. So Jesus is saying that this command is something that God wants us to do, but you figured out a way around it. And then in Ephesians chapter 6, the Apostle Paul then quotes the same Old Testament command from Exodus when he says in verse 1 of chapter 6 to the letter to the Ephesians, he says, children, obey your parents in the Lord, for this is right. And then he quotes the Old Testament passage, honor your father and mother. And then he adds to it, he goes, which is the first commandment with a promise. And then he quotes it, so that it may go well with you and that you may enjoy long life on the earth. So it's interesting in these passages, a couple things we need to point out, particularly the Pauline passage. That is, he says, we are to do this. Therefore, it's a part of spiritual growth. And we can't have a tradition of man, according to Matthew chapter 15, or our own feelings or our own sensibilities that say, well, I'm not going to do it because I have a right not to do it. You didn't know my father. You didn't know my mom, or they were terrible people. That may be true. I'm not arguing that at all. But what Jesus is saying is you can't create a tradition of man to get around this. So, well, why would he say that? Why is he saying, well, you can't get around it? And then Paul, I think it expands the answer to that question while he says, it's a commandment with a promise. And maybe the one reason why you don't want to get around this command is because you want it to go well with you. So what does that mean, go well with you? And then he says, you may enjoy a long life. So the promise is your life will be extended if you do this, and the life that you live will go better than if you did not. So I think that there's a very specific essence here of what he's saying is that regardless of how good or bad your mother and father were or are, you must find a way to honor them so that your life goes well in the here and now, and you live longer here upon the earth. So it's a very important step in growing stronger in your faith in order that the strong faith you're growing develops or manifests in your life right now, things going better, because that's why I want to coach you up in your faith. The more you grow in your faith, the stronger you are, the better your life becomes, right? And so this is definitely, this simple principle, a part of this process.
Well, and I think, like you said, especially these days, but probably happened back then too, there's a lot of excuses of why I don't want to or feel like or desire to do these things, right? And you could take that to most of the things we're called to do in our lives too, right?
Sure.
But
absolutely.
This one's pretty easy because it's usually, especially with words like trauma thrown around so easily these days, it's really easy to be like, well, I didn't do whatever. Now, that's not to say there aren't people who haven't experienced trauma or who have come from families that are very broken, very messed up. But I'm assuming you're also going to talk about honor may look different than we think it is. It doesn't mean you have to go and, wait on them hand and foot every day, right? Like that's not the kind of honor you're talking about.
No.
There's something different. And I think that's what we have to kind of discuss a little bit is honor. In our brains these days, you kind of think of like, oh, well, we have to be subservient. We have to do all these different things to honor someone versus, because, when you hear honor, it's usually in royalty or like the president's honoring you with a medal. Like there's those kinds of things. Yeah. And that's where we use honor these days more often than what they probably meant traditionally.
Well, I think
right?
Specifically, it's even more important for a person who has had a really bad mother or father, like I remember a young lady who her father had molested her and he went to prison for it. They caught him. He went to prison for a long time. And so, I remember this was probably 20 years ago, and she was just saying, well, I hate men, I hate this, I hate that. And so she went to therapy, and through the process of therapy, it was like, well, the person who sinned against me was my father. It wasn't fathers.
Right.
And so, sometimes when we take the sin of an individual and then we conflate it with that must represent this entire group, then what happens is now we're in bondage, you see, instead of laying the blame where the blame belongs. And so when you honor something, I'm not honoring this individual and their sin against me. I'm honoring the entire legacy and group of fatherhood, right? And for every bad father, there's 1,000 good fathers. And so it allows me to trust when I need to trust. It allows me to follow when I need to follow. And that allows me to live longer on the earth, and may things go well for me right now. Because if that young lady hadn't gotten over that or healed from that, then do you think that her life right now would have gone well, spending her whole life hating all men? No, it wouldn't, right? She couldn't have had, met a man and started a family, and without that tainting it so much, it poisons it. So you're getting the picture here. And what we're talking about in particular on this week is mothers, right? And so it's not what we intend or what we want or dream about that gets us where we need to be. It's what we actually do. It's the steps we take. I've talked about this in the past. It's called the principle of the path. Just take steps in a certain direction. And that makes all the difference where you end up. So whether your mother was great or whether your mother struggled or was flawed, do something to honor motherhood on Mother's Day, right? Now, it could be your mother, it could be your grandmother, it could be your aunt who's a mother, your sister who's a mother, it could be you as a mother. Maybe you're a man and your mother did a bad job, but now you're married and your wife is the mother of your children. So you'll figure this out. The key is, how do you honor motherhood on Mother's Day? And the reason why you want to do this is because what we honor is what we value. And what we value becomes the foundation of our future. You see, as a matter of fact, it is so important to try and celebrate motherhood, not just on Mother's Day, but all year round. And the reason why is because the core values that motherhood instills and brings out are valuable to everyday life. And that's why the command: honor your mother and father, and your life will go well. So let me kind of give you some handles on this. Okay, let's look at the scriptures and see what are the things that motherhood provides that we can honor. And whether your mother lived up to that or somebody in your life lived up to that or not, you can honor the intent. For instance, in Deuteronomy chapter 4, verse 9, it says this: only be careful and watch yourselves closely so that you do not forget the things your eyes have seen or let them fade from your heart as long as you live. So he's saying, be really careful to not forget this testimony to the Lord and your core value that the Lord and the Lord alone is the one who's provided. He goes, teach them to your children and to their children after them. Motherhood is about remembering the most important things in life and then passing them on to the next generation. Mm-hmm. Now, if your mother was I don't want to talk too much about it, but if your mother didn't do a good job of this, you have to realize the fact that you can compare the job she did and make a judgment that she didn't do as good as she could have came from somewhere. So you have to ask yourself, well, how do I even know if my mom didn't do a good job? Well, because other mothers and other motherhood has remembered the most important things and passed it down to give you a frame of reference.
Right.
So that's why you want to honor motherhood. In John chapter 16, verse 21, it says this: a woman giving birth to a child has pain because her time has come. But when her baby is born, she forgets the anguish because of her joy that a child is born into the world. Motherhood is an example on how we can live life, that there will be moments of pain and moments of suffering. But guess what? It's forgotten in the joy of what it begins, particularly childbirth. You know, they call it labor for a reason.
Right.
And it's very painful, but very shortly after, women start, you know, they forget the pain and they remember the joy. What a beautiful thing. I mean, if guys had to give birth, sometimes guys, when it comes to pain, they never forget.
Right.
You know what I'm saying? They don't forget.
Yeah.
And all the emotions in the world, it's not going to change their mind.
You're not going to convince them to go back through that again.
Yeah, they're like, hey, honey, you know, you've got a gaping wound in your thigh. Please go to the doctor. No, I'm never going to the doctor. I don't want to go to the doctor. Why? I don't know, because when he was 9, he went to the doctor, and the doctor did something that hurt him, and he
gave him a shot.
You gave him a shot. He'll never forget that, right? But so praise God that it's women who give birth, because shortly thereafter, all of the wonder and joy allows them to forget of the pain and suffering of labor. You know, motherhood is so much more important, too, in our intimate relationships. Listen to this in the Song of Solomon, chapter 8, verse 2. It says, it's quoting the bride, and she says, I would lead you, I would bring you to my mother's house, and she would teach me what to do. I would give you spiced wine to drink and some of my fresh pomegranate juice. So what is she saying? She's saying, I'm learning from my mother how to love my husband, just in a practical way, but in an intimate way as well. Mothers show us how to have healthy, intimate relationships. They have kind of a radar about them. So when we honor motherhood, we're honoring and valuing the importance of good, intimate relationships, right? The notion that you want to have a good marriage. See, there's a direct connection here. Like, you just got married, right? Last fall. What is it, 6 months now?
Almost 6 months.
Almost 6 months. Congratulations. And one of your dreams from that day forward is that you have a good marriage, right?
Right.
You want to enjoy it. Well, what keeps the value of having a good marriage is a goal, is a desire. Well, you, by learning to honor your mother and father, regardless of how well they did, helps you keep that goal bright and burning in your own relationship, right? So there's a direct connection there. In 2 Timothy chapter 1, verse 5, it talks about the role of women in the development of our faith. Mothers in the development of our faith. It says, I am reminded of your authentic faith. So Paul is telling Timothy, he goes, you have an authentic faith, which first lived in your grandmother, Lois, and then your mother, Eunice. I'm sure that this faith is also inside of you. So notice what Paul is saying. He's saying the faith that Timothy has first lived in his mother, Eunice, and then before that lived in his grandmother Lois. And so who carried that authentic faith and passed it on? It was mom and grandma.
Right.
You know, what a powerful thing. In Proverbs chapter 6, verse 20 and 22, it says, my child, obey your father's godly instruction and follow your mother's life-giving teaching. Fill your heart with their advice and let your life be shaped by what they've taught you. Their wisdom will guide you wherever you go and keep you from bringing harm to yourself. Their instruction will whisper to you at every sunrise and direct you through a brand new day. The reason we should celebrate mothers and motherhood all year round is because mothers give us instruction that is life-giving, right?
Right.
Her instruction can show you the practical side of how to live. It's really interesting, you know, growing up. It was my mother who taught me how to cook. My dad didn't teach me how to cook. It was my mother who taught me how to do my own laundry. It was my mother who taught me how to make friends. It was my mother who taught me how to organize my schoolwork and get things done. You know, my mother is the one who taught me all of these life skills, and they are life-giving skills. And so when I honor motherhood, I'm honoring what? These life-giving skills that people need to learn. In Proverbs chapter 22, verse 6, it says, train up a child in the way they should go, and when they are old, they will not depart from it. Mothers have the capacity to see what a child is learning right now and connect it to the impact in their life later on. And so, you see, all of these things motherhood brings to the table. And when we honor motherhood, we're honoring these values that make life better.
Yeah, I mean, I look to all of these things you brought up. I can think of things that either my mom did or my grandmother did, or women in my life who have kind of quasi adopted me as their son, right? I've learned all these different things from them. Even my faith journey, my grandmother was key in that, right? Just like Timothy talks about, you know, half of the reason I can do my own laundry and cook is because my mother taught me, right? Like you think back that, and it's like, even where my mother or grandmother may have failed, there are still so many things and influences in my life that are because of them, or because of women in my life who chose to step up as motherly influences, right? Yeah. And I think that is so easy to forget these days, where it's kind of a society of, well, they screwed up once, therefore they're dead to me forever kind of a thing, right? Versus, you know, I am who I am today because of them, for good or bad, right? And there's something to be said about that.
Yeah, I think so. I think mothers, you know, seem to be, you know, even mothers who don't do well are nurturers. It's really interesting. I was talking to a social worker who works with health and welfare, and they were talking about that the thing that helps women who are addicted or women who are struggling get clean and go through programs and get better is their children.
Yeah.
You know, it's like the primary motivation for these women is, the social worker says, is that they need to get back with their children. And so that ties into that just deep-seated core way in which they're wired by God, you know, in the image of God, that they are nurturers. And there's a definite difference between men and women when it comes to the way God has wired us. And I think that it's reflected in the things that bring women joy, right? Some of the things that bring women joy, like these women get right, they get back with their kids so that they can nurture them. Guess what? That brings them joy. Their healing journey helped. Mothers who, you know, who don't have struggles, but who done really, really well. A lot of women who are working, they work because they work to nurture their kids, right? Sometimes guys just work to work, right? Some guys just work to get the next deal or whatever. But women, it's always, wow, I'm working because this is what's good for my kids and my family. I think this is what reflects the scriptural teaching in the third letter of John, chapter 1, verse 4, where he says, I have no greater joy than to hear that my children are walking in the truth. In Leviticus 19, verse 3, each of you must respect your mother and father, and you must observe the Sabbath, for I am the Lord your God. So isn't that interesting? He says, respect your mom and dad and take a break. Observe the Sabbath because I am God.
Right.
And okay, I'm not really sure how all that's connected, but it is. Because it's all in one verse right there in Leviticus. In Psalms 127, verse 3, it says, behold, children are a heritage from the Lord, the fruit of the womb, a reward. And so I just think it's really important to understand that let us celebrate the unique capacity that a female has, and that is she can become a mother. Guys can't do that. Right. We'll talk more about this on Thursday's podcast, but right now I just want you to understand the biblical teaching that revolves around the value, the importance, the integrity, the roles that motherhood can and should play in our lives.
Yeah, I think more often than not, one of the best things about Mother's Day, and something we could take throughout the year, is just acknowledging that there are great mothers and there are just mothers, right? Like not every mother is great, and that's okay, but we can acknowledge that there's some women, a lot of women in this world working really hard.
Even an average mom is a great mom.
Yes, she is. And so I think there's just a lot of times they just want to be acknowledged, to know that they're seen, that they're they're working hard and that it matters, right? Like, I think
absolutely
a lot of the times that's the best thing you can do for a mom is just say, Mom, I see you. I appreciate all the things you're doing, seen and unseen. And what you are doing matters. It's not nothing.
And that's so important because in Proverbs, it's a really interesting verse, chapter 14. It says this: a wise woman will build her house, but with her own hands, the foolish woman tears hers down. And that's really interesting, is that what you just said. It's important to tell mothers why we value them and how important they are.
Even if they're not a words of affirmation person, right?
Yeah.
Like, I think it's one of the reasons mothers cherish this day so much is it's kind of the one time a year that you'll be like, you know what? You do a lot of things around here. You know, the kids are like trying to help out in the kitchen, and, you know, the husband or whatever might be like, oh, I'll do this thing. And most of the time, from what I hear from mothers around the office, they're like, it's usually a worse mess than if they hadn't helped at all. But if anything, it gives them kind of a perspective of like, oh, Mom, you do a lot of things. Or I didn't know you. There's that joke, I think you told it at my wedding, where it was like, oh, did you know if you put the clothes in this magic bin over here, they just come back clean sometimes? And it was kind of a joke about, you know, my wife having
this
done the
guy was going, hey, honey, why are you so stressed out? And she was like, well, I've got so much to do. And he goes, well, what do you mean? She goes, I've got laundry and stuff. And he goes, well, here, let me help you out. And he goes over to the laundry bin and he says, if you throw things in there, they just magically show up folded on your bed.
Right. And so it's like, that's a hilarious joke, but there's a lot of those things that I think we just take for granted, especially with moms, where it's like, she's doing all these things and this is the one time a year we do it, which is why it's usually so sacred and important to moms. But it's like, we could take those principles and go, hey, I see all the things you're doing, and spread it out through the year, and they would feel joy more from that than just one day a year you go, oh, hey, you are doing a lot of things, right?
Yeah, and I want I want mothers to feel that they're valued and that they are important, and that Scripture talks so much that they're not housekeepers, right? That what they're teaching is character and discipline. They're teaching some of the greatest things about life. Their instruction is life-giving.
Yes.
And that's so important because guess what? A foolish woman will tear her house down with her own hands, but a wise woman will build it up. And think about that verse. Think about the power of that verse, and that is that women have a huge, powerful influence on their home. Yeah. They can build it up or they can tear it down. And this Scripture specifically says they choose what they will do. So we just really want to continue to talk about the significance and importance of mothers, and we want to encourage everyone to find ways in which they can honor motherhood and honor their own mother.
Absolutely. Well, thank you, Pastor, so much for sharing that with us. Thank you for 399 episodes of life-giving and thought-challenging podcasting with me.
A little bit of ranting and raving.
And a little bit of ranting and raving and extra dashes of salt here and there.
Yes.
But I'm excited for episode 400 on Thursday. We're going to be continuing to talk about mothers. And thank you, mothers, for all you do. We see you and we acknowledge you. And we're so excited to celebrate you this weekend.
Yes. And stay salty by always think for yourself.